The house was always quiet at this time of day. The sun hung lazily over the tall glass windows, spilling light across the polished wooden floor, making every corner of the billionaire's mansion shine like it was made for a magazine cover. He had never thought he would be back this early. Business trips, long meetings, endless phone calls. His life was always moving, always demanding, and always somewhere else. But that day something unusual pulled him home before the rest of the world expected. He stepped out of his sleek black car, briefcase in hand, and took a deep breath of the late afternoon air. For years he had treated his house as a resting place, not a home. It was a place where he closed his eyes after exhausting victories in boardrooms and million-dollar negotiations. His true energy, his true passion, was usually poured into contracts and numbers. Yet as he stood at his own front door, he felt something strange, a sense of hesitation, as if he was about to enter a space he had not truly known for a very long time. The key clicked. The door opened. His eyes adjusted to the familiar interior. The calm gray sofa, the carefully arranged flowers on the table, the art on the walls chosen by decorators rather than family. It looked perfect, flawless, almost too untouched, but as he stepped further inside, the sound that reached his ears was what stopped him completely. It was not silence. It was not the hum of the air conditioner or the ticking of the expensive grandfather clock. It was something raw, something human, a small voice, strained yet determined, a voice he recognized but had not heard like this before. His son. The boy's voice came from the living room, mixed with a softer, guiding tone. He walked quickly toward it, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, and what he saw when he reached the doorway made him freeze in place. There was his son, the boy who for months had been trapped in a wheelchair after an accident that nearly crushed the family's hope. The boy who had been told by doctors that walking again was unlikely. The boy who had smiled bravely even when his father avoided eye contact. Too uncomfortable to face the truth. Now that same child was standing, wobbling, trembling but standing on crutches. His little hands gripped the metal tightly. His legs were wrapped in braces, each step looking like a battle between pain and courage. Beside him, kneeling on the floor, was the maid. She wore her simple uniform, but her presence was anything but ordinary. She guided him, encouraged him, her hand lightly steadying his knee brace while whispering words of strength. "Just one more step," she said softly. The boy bit his lip, his face tense, but he moved forward. One crutch clicked, then the other. Then his foot shuffled ahead. He nearly fell, but the maid's hand caught him gently, just enough to keep him from collapsing. The billionaire felt his breath catch in his throat. He had never seen this before. Not in the hospitals, not in the therapy sessions he occasionally attended, but often skipped for work. Not in any of the reports he asked his staff to summarize. This was different. This was not medical progress written on a chart. This was life, his son's life, fighting to rise from the shadows. For a moment, he did not move. His hand tightened on the handle of his briefcase. He wanted to speak, but no words came. His throat felt dry, his chest heavy, as if years of distance between him and his child were suddenly pressing down on him. The maid's voice broke through his thoughts. "You are doing so well. Look how strong you are," she said, her tone filled with pride that sounded almost like a mother's. The boy took another step. His small face glistened with sweat, his curly hair sticking slightly to his forehead. His eyes were filled with determination that seemed far older than his years. He was not just moving his legs. He was moving his entire soul forward. The father's eyes burned, though he would not admit it even to himself. He had seen billion-dollar deals fall apart, corporations crumble, and markets crash. But nothing had ever shaken him like this. His son was taking steps, tiny, unsteady, but monumental, and the billionaire had not been there to witness the first ones. A strange ache filled his chest. How many of these moments had he missed? How many smiles, tears, or brave attempts had happened inside these walls while he was away chasing wealth? For years he had told himself it was all for his family, that his sacrifices were their future. But watching his son stumble forward, supported by someone else, he wondered if he had mistaken his priorities. The maid looked up for a moment, her eyes catching his. She froze, surprised to see him standing there. For a second, fear crossed her face as if she expected anger for doing something she was not supposed to do. But then she saw his expression, stunned, softened, almost broken. and she understood that this was not a moment for silence. "Sir?" she whispered, unsure if she had interrupted something sacred, but he did not respond. He could not. His gaze stayed locked on his boy. The child paused, breathing hard, then looked up and finally saw him too. His eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed embarrassed, as if his father had caught him failing. But then with a small, shaky smile, he said, "Dad, look, I'm walking." The billionaire's heart shattered. His son's voice was trembling, but it carried more pride than any shareholder's applause. In those 3 words, "I'm walking," he heard not just progress but hope, courage, and a plea for recognition. He wanted to rush forward, to throw his arms around the boy, to tell him how proud he was. But he stood frozen, his own emotions betraying the image of control he had spent his life perfecting. The boy took one more step. The maid steadied him again, her hand light, her words gentle. The father realized something that shook him to the core. This woman, whom he had always seen as just staff, had been the one standing beside his son when he could not. She had been the one who believed, who gave time, patience, and care. She had been the one who filled the gap his absence had left. He finally stepped forward, setting down his briefcase quietly on the floor. His footsteps were slow, uncertain, almost timid, a strange contrast to the confident man the world knew in offices and news articles. Each step toward his son felt heavier than any journey he had taken in his business empire, and in that moment, the father knew. This was not just about his son's recovery. This was about something far deeper. It was about rediscovering what mattered, about realizing that sometimes the greatest battles were not fought in boardrooms but in living rooms. With crutches, braces, and love, the boy smiled faintly, sweat dripping down his face. "I can do it, Dad," he whispered. The billionaire felt his eyes blur with tears. He had not cried in years, not even at funerals or failures, but now, watching his child take one small, shaky step, his entire world shifted. For the first time in a long time, he felt powerless, and yet, for the first time in forever, he felt human. The house felt different after that moment. For the billionaire, walking into his own living room had been like stepping into another world. He had expected stillness, the kind of quiet that filled the halls when he was gone, but instead he had walked into a miracle he never knew was happening. He stood there long after his son took those few unsteady steps, his mind unable to let go of the sight. The maid had helped his son walk. His boy, who had been told he might never stand again, was slowly winning a battle everyone else had quietly given up on. It was a truth that left him shaken in ways that no business storm ever had. When the maid excused herself to help the boy sit down and rest, the father lingered nearby, almost unsure of his place in the room. For years he had poured himself into board meetings, conferences, international flights, and late-night negotiations, always believing that this was how a man built a legacy. Yet in that very instant, looking at his son leaning back against the couch with sweat still shining on his forehead, the father realized there were legacies money could never buy. What he did not know, what he was about to discover, was that this progress had not happened overnight. It was not luck or a sudden miracle. It was the result of hidden effort, quiet, patient, tireless effort that had unfolded within these walls when he was not here to see. The maid had been working with the boy for months. Each morning, while the father buried himself in endless calls, the boy would wake to the sound of gentle encouragement. His legs, stiff from long hours of sitting in a wheelchair, were slowly massaged and stretched. The braces, heavy and uncomfortable, were strapped on not by doctors but by her hands, and every step he had taken that day was built on hundreds of smaller, quieter attempts that no one outside the house knew about. She had been there through the tears, the pain, and the failures that never made it into medical reports. It was not easy for the boy either. There were days when he cried in frustration, when his legs felt like stone and his spirit threatened to give up. He hated the pain. He hated how slow everything felt. But what he did not hate was the way she believed in him. She would look him in the eye, steady and certain, and tell him that tomorrow would be better. That strength was not built in one day, but in many. The boy held on to her faith because sometimes it was stronger than his own. The billionaire listened quietly one evening as the maid, in her simple and honest way, explained how it all began. She had noticed something the doctors had overlooked. The boy still had a spark in his legs, a faint signal of life, something that could be nurtured. It was small, but she refused to let it die. She had not studied medicine, had no great degree to her name, yet she carried something else, a heart that refused to let go of hope. And with that, she had begun the slow daily process of guiding him back toward walking. The father felt guilt tighten inside him like a rope. How had he missed all of this? How had the determination of his own child and the sacrifice of the woman in front of him slipped under his notice? He had been so focused on running the world outside that he had not seen the world inside his own home. All those nights when he thought he was doing enough by sending money, by hiring specialists, by paying for treatments, he had not realized that what his son needed most was presence, encouragement, and time. He watched now as the maid knelt down again, checking the boy's braces, her hands gentle but firm, like someone who cared not because she was paid but because she wanted to. She guided his son as he tried again, step after step, her own knees pressing against the hard floor without complaint. It was not glamorous work. No spotlight, no headlines, no applause. But it was the kind of work that changed lives, the kind that could never be measured in money. The boy's face glowed with effort, his cheeks red, his breath heavy. But beneath the struggle there was something else, pride. He knew he was doing something no one thought possible. He knew he was fighting back against every prediction, every doubt. Every whispered, he may never walk again. And though his legs wobbled, his heart stood tall. The billionaire realized that hidden effort had been living under his roof all along. His son's courage had been building step by step, and the maid's devotion had been the foundation holding him steady. And he had almost missed it. That night, long after the boy had fallen asleep, the father stayed awake in his office, staring at nothing in particular. His mind kept replaying the sound of the crutches tapping against the floor, the sight of his son's trembling legs moving forward, the maid's soft words of encouragement. They echoed louder than any business victory he had ever won. For the first time, he questioned himself in a way he never had before. He was a man who could solve problems that spanned nations, who could sign deals that influenced markets, who could command respect in rooms filled with power. Yet here, in the quiet of his own home, the real battle for hope and progress had been fought without him. And the one who had led that fight was not him. It was the woman he had overlooked countless times. The woman who quietly worked in the background, her life invisible to the glittering circles he belonged to. She had no wealth, no prestige, no recognition, but she had given his son something more valuable than all of that: belief. The next morning, when he walked into the living room, he found them there again. The boy stood on his crutches, sweat already forming, determination written across his face. The maid was beside him, encouraging softly. The billionaire set down his phone, ignored the emails flooding his inbox, and simply watched. This time he did not stand at a distance. He stepped closer. And as his son took another shaky step, the father found himself whispering encouragement too, his voice breaking but real. It was the beginning of something new, though he did not yet realize it fully. The hidden effort that had carried his son this far was no longer invisible to him. It was alive, breathing, undeniable, and for the first time he knew he had to be part of it. Not as a billionaire, not as a man of power, but as a father. The boy sat quietly on the couch, his legs strapped in braces that looked far too heavy for someone so young. His small hands rubbed the edges of the metal as if he were reminding himself that these were not chains but tools, not reminders of his weakness, but proof of his fight. The billionaire watched from the chair across the room, his heart heavier than he ever expected it could be. He had spent years believing strength came from power, wealth, and control, but now he was beginning to understand that strength could also be found in the smallest, most fragile-looking frame of a child who refused to surrender. Every morning began the same way. The boy would wake, rub his eyes with tired hands, and stare at the crutches leaning against the wall. Some days he looked at them with determination, other days with dread, but every single morning he chose to stand. The maid was always there to help, to steady him, to encourage him, but she never carried him. She knew he did not want to be carried anymore. He wanted to fight. He wanted to earn every step. When his father began watching, the boy felt something stir inside him. For months he had dreamed of the day when his father would see not just his wheelchair but his effort. He wanted his father to know that he was not just surviving. He was trying to conquer, and now with his father present, every step became more than an exercise. It became a declaration. The boy's legs trembled as he lifted himself with the crutches. His small arms bore most of the weight, his braces clinking lightly as he steadied himself. He took one step, then another, each movement slow as if time itself was bending to watch. His breath came fast, sweat ran down his temples, but he did not stop. In his heart was a voice that shouted louder than the pain. Keep going. His father leaned forward, his own hands gripping the edge of the chair. He wanted to rush forward to help, to catch his son before he fell. But something inside told him to hold back. This was not about preventing a fall. It was about allowing the boy to rise. The maid's gentle presence was enough, her soft encouragement guiding the boy forward, but it was the boy's willpower that carried him. On the third step, the boy faltered. His crutch slipped slightly and his leg bent at an awkward angle. The billionaire's heart leapt into his throat. But before he could move, the boy tightened his grip, steadied himself, and pushed forward again. His face twisted in pain, but his eyes remained locked ahead, refusing to surrender. "I can do it," he whispered, though his voice was barely more than a breath. And in that moment, the father saw something extraordinary. This was not just a child trying to walk. This was a warrior fighting a battle no one else could fight for him. The crutches were not just tools. They were weapons against despair. The braces were not just supports. They were armor, and every shaky step was a victory against the darkness of doubt. The billionaire thought of all the times he had given up on things that did not go his way, the times he had chosen easier paths because they were more profitable or less painful. He thought of how quickly he had accepted the doctor's words when they said his son might never walk again. He had treated those words like unshakable truth, but here was his son proving that even the impossible could bend under determination. Day after day, the boy pushed himself further. Some mornings he managed only a few steps before collapsing into exhaustion. Other days he surprised everyone, moving across the room slowly but steadily, his face glowing with pride. He fell often, his small body hitting the ground with a thud that made his father's heart ache. But every single time he reached out for the crutches, pulled himself up, and tried again. His father began to see a pattern. The boy never counted his failures. He never measured how many times he had fallen. He only counted the steps he managed to take. To him, progress was not about perfection. It was about persistence. And that persistence became his shield. At night, when the boy lay in bed, his legs sore and heavy, he still whispered promises to himself. "Tomorrow I'll go further. Tomorrow I'll be stronger." His small hands would grip the blanket tightly as if holding on to that dream. The maid often heard him and smiled quietly, knowing that determination this pure could not be taught. It had to be born from the heart. The billionaire began to change too. Instead of rushing off to early meetings, he found himself staying home longer, just to watch his son practice. Instead of ending his day with tired phone calls, he would sit quietly in the living room, listening to the crutches tap across the floor. His world was no longer measured in profits and contracts, but in steps and smiles. One afternoon, the boy managed to cross from the couch to the far wall. It took him nearly half an hour, his face red with strain, his arms shaking from the effort. When he reached the wall, he leaned against it and turned back, his eyes shining with triumph. "Did you see that, Dad?" he asked, his voice filled with pride. The billionaire's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak at first, then finally whispered, "Yes, I saw." The boy's smile widened. That was all he had wanted for his father to see. Not to pity him, not to protect him, but to see him. From that day forward, the boy's determination grew stronger. His father's presence became fuel, pushing him to go further, to endure more, to never stop. And the billionaire, who once believed money was the greatest form of power, learned that true power was watching a child refuse to give up. The boy's determination became the heartbeat of the house. Every step echoed louder than any business deal. Every stumble carried more weight than any stock market crash. And every smile after a successful walk was worth more than all the wealth locked away in banks. The father finally understood. Determination was not about being the strongest or the richest. It was about standing up when the world told you to sit, about moving forward when your body begged you to stop, about believing when everyone else doubted. And his son, his fragile, brave, unstoppable son, was teaching him that lesson every single day. The boy's journey toward walking again was not only a story of courage, it was also a story of devotion. Behind every step he took was a quiet figure, a woman whose life had never been written about in newspapers, whose name had never been spoken in grand halls, but whose actions carried more weight than any title or fortune. She was the maid, and while her role in the house had always been seen as ordinary, her devotion was anything but. Every morning, she was the first to rise. Long before the mansion filled with the noise of calls and staff, she moved through the hallways with quiet steps, her thoughts already with the boy who needed her. She entered his room not as an employee, but as someone carrying the responsibility of hope. The world might have seen her as a servant, but the boy saw her as the one person who refused to give up on him. Her voice was soft, yet it carried power. When she whispered, "You can do it," those words wrapped around his fragile spirit like armor. The billionaire had never really looked at her before. She had always been a shadow in the background, moving through his world silently, carrying trays, cleaning rooms, making sure life in the house ran smoothly. He had thought of her as part of the staff, someone replaceable, someone ordinary. But watching her now, kneeling beside his son, steadying his crutches, drying his tears, he realized she was extraordinary. She gave something he could not pay for, something no doctor or therapist had managed to give. She gave her heart. Her devotion was not just in the hours she spent with the boy. It was in the way she believed when others doubted. The doctors had spoken with clinical detachment, saying there was only a slim chance of progress. Relatives had whispered that perhaps it was time to accept the truth. Even the father, with all his power and resources, had allowed those words to shape his expectations. But she refused. She saw something no one else cared to look for. The spark in the boy's eyes, the faint twitch in his leg, the stubborn spirit that wanted to rise. She held on to those small signs and built them into a mountain of hope. There were days when the boy screamed in frustration, when he threw the crutches aside and cried that it was useless. On those days she did not scold him, nor did she let him stay on the ground. She sat beside him, placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and told him stories of strength. Stories of people who had fallen yet risen again. She told him that walking was not just about legs, it was about heart, about refusing to let the world tell you who you were. And slowly, those words stitched courage back into the boy's chest. The billionaire began to notice the details. He saw how her knees were bruised from hours of kneeling beside him. He saw how her hands, rough from work, grew red from adjusting braces and carrying the boy when he collapsed. He saw the exhaustion in her face at night, yet she never once complained. She did not have to do any of this. Her job was to clean, to cook, to keep the house in order. Helping the boy walk again was far beyond what anyone expected of her. Yet she chose to give more because to her this was not a duty, it was love. One evening, after watching another long session of practice, the father asked her quietly, "Why? Why are you doing all of this?" His voice was not commanding, not like the man he was in his businesses, but curious, almost humbled. She looked at him with steady eyes, the kind that carried truth. Because he needs someone to believe in him every day. Not sometimes, not when it's convenient, but every single day. If I stop, he stops. If I doubt, he doubts. So I cannot stop and I cannot doubt. The words sank into him with the weight of honesty. In all his wealth, he had never thought of devotion in that way. To him, devotion had been measured in contracts, in loyalty bought with money. But here was a woman who had nothing, yet gave everything without asking for recognition, without asking for reward. The boy's progress was slow, but it was steady. And each time he took a step, the maid's face lit up with pride, as if she were his own mother. The billionaire noticed that she never celebrated herself. She never said, "I helped you do this." She always said, "You did it." She gave all the credit to the boy. Even though her hands had guided him, her voice had carried him, her heart had steadied him. As the days turned into weeks, the father began to see how deeply her devotion had shaped his son. The boy did not just walk differently, he believed differently. He believed he was capable, that he was strong, that he had value beyond his wheelchair. That belief had been planted and watered by the maid's constant encouragement. Without her, he might have stayed seated forever. Not because he could not walk, but because he would not have believed he could. The billionaire often sat late at night, thinking of all the times he had equated worth with wealth. He thought of the long hours he had spent building his empire, while inside his own home someone else was building something far greater, a child's spirit. The irony cut deep. For years he had thought he was the provider, the protector, the one holding the family together. But in truth, this woman had been carrying more than he ever had, with nothing but her determination and care. One night he walked into the living room to find her asleep on the floor, her back resting against the couch, her hand still lightly holding the boy's leg as if protecting him even in sleep. He stood there silently, overwhelmed by the quiet strength in that scene. In that moment he realized she was not just a maid. She was a guardian, a healer, a silent warrior. Her devotion had rebuilt what he had nearly lost. The father began to respect her in ways he had never respected anyone before. He no longer saw her as just part of the staff. He saw her as part of the reason his son had a chance at a future. And deep inside he began to understand that true greatness was not always found in high towers or financial empires. Sometimes it was found in the quiet devotion of someone who chose to love without limit. The boy's journey was far from over, but one truth had already become clear. He was walking not only because of his own determination, but because of the devotion that never left his side. And the billionaire, once blind to it, now carried that truth like a mirror, showing him who he had been and who he could become. The billionaire had built his life around numbers, schedules, and strategies. His mornings had always begun with phone calls to distant offices, his afternoons with meetings in glass towers, and his nights with reports filled with charts and forecasts. He had always believed that this was what a man should do: provide, protect, and prepare for the future. Yet as he sat in the living room one evening, watching his son practice standing again, he began to question everything he thought he knew about success. It had been weeks since he first came home early and saw his son take those fragile steps. At first he had thought it was a passing moment, something to admire briefly before returning to the whirlwind of his empire. But the more time he spent at home, the more he realized that this was not a temporary moment. It was a lesson, and it was reshaping him in ways he had never expected. He began to notice the small things, the way his son's hand shook when he gripped the crutches but refused to let go, the way sweat poured down his face but his lips still whispered, "I can do it." The way the maid's voice never tired of saying one more step, "You are stronger than you think." These were details he would have missed before, too busy staring at numbers on screens to notice the miracles unfolding in his own home. One morning, he surprised his staff by canceling a major meeting. Instead of sitting in a boardroom surrounded by men in suits, he sat on the floor of the living room, watching his son attempt to walk across the rug. His assistant called 3 times to remind him of the importance of the meeting, but each time he said the same thing: "This is more important." The words shocked even him. He had never said them before, never put anything above business. But now, watching his boy stumble, fall, and rise again, he knew no deal in the world was worth missing this. At first, he felt guilt more than pride. He realized how much he had missed, how many moments had passed without him, how many tears his son had shed without a father's hand to wipe them away. But slowly, guilt began to turn into something else: awareness. He began to see that awakening was not about punishing himself for the past, but about choosing differently for the future. He could not undo the years he had lost, but he could decide how to spend the years that remained. The boy began to notice the change too. When he looked up from his crutches, he no longer saw only the maid cheering him on. He saw his father standing beside her, eyes filled not with distance but with pride. For the boy, that was fuel. Every step he took now was not just for himself but also to prove to his father that he was strong, that he was worth believing in. And for the first time in years, the bond between them began to heal. The billionaire started to learn patience. In business, he had always demanded quick results. Delays were failures, setbacks were unacceptable. But here, in the quiet of his home, he realized that progress was not measured in speed but in persistence. A single step might take minutes, an attempt might end in collapse, but each effort mattered. He began to cheer for progress he would have once dismissed as insignificant. When his son managed 3 steps instead of 2, he clapped. When his son stood for an extra 30 seconds, he celebrated. He learned that greatness was not always about leaps forward, but about the courage to keep moving when the ground felt heavy. The maid noticed his change as well. She saw how he now stayed longer at home, how he asked about his son's exercises, how he even knelt on the floor once to steady his boy's crutches himself. She had never imagined the powerful man she worked for could look so human, so vulnerable, But she realized this was not weakness, it was awakening. The man who once measured life in profits was beginning to measure it in love. The billionaire also began to remember his own childhood. He thought of his father, a man who had worked long hours in a small shop to provide for the family. He remembered the way his father would come home tired but would still lift him up, laugh with him, listen to him. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that lesson. He had told himself he was doing the same thing, working hard for the sake of his family. But he had forgotten that presence mattered more than profit. And now, through his son, life was teaching him again. One evening, as his son sat exhausted on the couch after another round of practice, the billionaire sat beside him. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, something he had not done in years. "I am proud of you," he said softly. The boy looked at him, surprised at first, then smiled, a smile that lit up the entire room. That smile was worth more than any fortune he had ever made. From then on, the father's awakening deepened. He began to cut down his business trips, choosing instead to stay home. He still worked, of course, but his work no longer consumed him. He learned to draw boundaries, to say no to deals that would take him away for weeks, to delegate tasks he once insisted on controlling. He realized that money could always be made again, but time with his son could never be recovered once it was gone. He also began to appreciate the maid in ways he never had before. He thanked her for her devotion, not with money but with words, something she valued even more. He told her that she was not just an employee but part of the reason his son was standing again. She lowered her head humbly, but her eyes filled with quiet pride. For her, that acknowledgement meant the world. The boy's progress continued, slow but steady, and with each step the father grew as well. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was a man learning to love, to value, to be present. His awakening was not about wealth but about worth, not about power but about presence. And as he watched his son move across the living room one evening, sweat dripping, determination blazing, he whispered to himself words he had never said before. "This is the greatest investment of my life." The living room had become more than a place for rest. It had turned into an arena of courage, a stage where a small boy fought battles larger than his fragile body should have endured. Every day the sound of crutches echoed against the walls, a rhythm that carried pain and hope together. The billionaire sat there more often now, no longer distracted by calls or schedules but fully present, his eyes following every movement of his son. And then came the day when everything changed, the day of the breakthrough. The morning began like any other. The maid had prepared the boy's braces, fastening them gently around his thin legs. The boy sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the crutches that leaned against the wall. But there was something different about his expression that day. His lips were pressed firmly together, his small jaw clenched with a determination even stronger than before. When he finally gripped the crutches, his father felt an invisible energy in the room. This was not just another attempt. This was a moment. The boy stood, his arms trembling slightly as he lifted himself. His father instinctively moved closer, ready to catch him if he fell, but the maid raised her hand slightly, signaling him to wait. She had seen this look before, the look of a child about to push beyond his limits. The boy's eyes locked straight ahead, and he whispered words that made both adults hold their breath. "Today I will walk across the room." It was a long room. The distance from the couch to the far wall seemed enormous even to someone strong and healthy. For a child whose legs had been trapped in a wheelchair for months, it was a mountain. But the boy did not see the wall as unreachable. He saw it as destiny. He took his first step, the crutch clicking against the floor, his brace shifting with effort. His father gripped his knees with his hands, silently praying. The first few steps were shaky but steady. His arms carried much of his weight, his shoulders straining, yet he moved forward. With every tap of the crutches, the father felt his own heart pound louder. The boy's breathing grew heavier, his face flushed, but his eyes remained sharp. He passed the first few feet, something he had done before, but instead of stopping to rest, he pressed forward. Halfway across the room, his arms shook violently. His legs wobbled under the braces, threatening to give way. The maid stepped closer, ready to hold him, but the boy shook his head. "No, don't help me. I need to do this." His voice was weak but filled with fire. The billionaire's eyes blurred with tears. He had built skyscrapers, signed contracts worth fortunes, and held power in rooms filled with leaders. But never had he seen strength like this. This was not strength built from wealth or status. This was pure, raw human will. The kind of strength that could not be bought, only born in struggle. Step by step he moved forward. Every inch was a victory, every stumble a reminder of how far he had come. He fell once, his knees hitting the rug hard. The sound made his father rise instantly, his instincts pushing him to rush forward. But before he could take more than one step, the boy planted his small palms on the ground, pushed himself up, grabbed the crutches again, and stood. "I'm not done," he said, breathless but unshaken. That moment broke something inside the father. Not in a painful way, but in a way that opened his eyes completely. He realized his son was not only walking, he was teaching. Teaching him what it meant to rise after falling. What it meant to believe when others doubted. What it meant to fight for every inch when the world expected you to stop. The boy kept going. One foot sliding forward, then the other. Crutches tapping a rhythm that filled the silence. The father whispered softly, his voice trembling, "You can do it, son. I'm here." He had never said those words before, not like this. But now they carried more weight than any promise he had ever made. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the boy reached the wall. He leaned against it, his small chest heaving, his arms trembling from exhaustion. Then he turned, his face glowing with sweat and pride, and looked straight at his father. His lips curled into a smile, tired yet victorious. "Dad," he whispered, "I made it." The father could no longer hold back. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees in front of his son, his arms open wide. The boy leaned into him, and for the first time in a long time the father held him close, not as a fragile child but as a warrior who had won. Tears fell freely down his face, and he did not care who saw. He pressed his forehead against his son's and whispered, "You are the bravest person I have ever known." The maid stood quietly in the background, her eyes moist with pride. She had seen many attempts, many falls, many tears, but she had also seen this child's unbreakable spirit, and now she witnessed the reward. It was not just about crossing the room. It was about proving to himself, to his father, and to the world that nothing was impossible when the heart refused to quit. From that day forward, the house was never the same. The breakthrough became the new heartbeat of their lives. The boy had shown them what strength looked like, and in doing so, he had changed the way his father saw everything. No longer was the mansion just a house filled with wealth. It became a home filled with purpose, filled with lessons that money could never teach. The father began to live differently. He woke each morning not thinking about meetings, but about his son's next steps. He celebrated progress not in profits, but in moments. He sat with his son, listened to him, encouraged him, and most importantly, believed in him. The boy no longer felt alone in his battle. His father was there now, not as a distant provider, but as a present companion. And though the path ahead was still long, the breakthrough had given them all something priceless, hope that could not be shaken. The boy had walked across the room, but in truth he had carried his family across a bridge of change. A bridge from doubt to faith, from absence to presence, from wealth to love. The billionaire had come home early that day weeks ago and could not believe what he saw. But now he believed. He believed in his son, in resilience, in devotion, and in the power of being present. And in that belief he discovered a treasure greater than any fortune he had ever built. The mansion had once been a place that reflected wealth but felt empty inside. Its walls had been decorated with expensive art, its halls lined with shining floors, and its rooms filled with luxury that impressed every guest. Yet none of it had ever made it feel like home. The billionaire had believed his legacy was in the empire he had built outside those walls, in the companies that bore his signature, and the contracts that carried his influence. But the day his son walked across the living room, everything he thought about legacy shifted. Now, for the first time, the mansion was alive, not with money, not with power, but with love, resilience, and meaning. The boy's breakthrough became a story retold every day within the house. The sound of crutches was no longer a reminder of weakness but of triumph. The maid, still quietly devoted, continued to guide and encourage, though now she was no longer alone. The father stood beside her, his presence strong, his pride unshaken. The boy woke each morning not with fear but with excitement, knowing that each step forward was not just progress in his recovery, but also a step toward a new kind of family life. The billionaire began to see his empire differently. Boardrooms no longer felt like the center of his life. Profits no longer felt like victories. Instead, he measured his success in the time he spent watching his son grow stronger, in the laughter that now filled the halls, in the simple dinners where conversations mattered more than business calls. He had once thought his wealth was his greatest achievement, but now he realized his true legacy would be the lessons he passed on to his son, lessons of courage, love, and presence. The boy, too, was changed forever. His determination did not end at the living room wall. Each day he pushed himself further, walking longer distances, standing taller, learning to trust his legs again. But more importantly, he learned to trust that he was not alone. His father's voice echoed in his ears now, steady and proud, replacing the silence that once felt like abandonment. He no longer fought only for himself. He fought with the knowledge that his courage inspired the people around him. The maid's role remained vital, but now it was recognized in ways it never had been before. The billionaire, who had once seen her only as staff, now treated her as part of the family. He thanked her not with gifts but with gratitude, acknowledging that without her devotion his son might never have stood again. She had not just helped the boy walk. She had helped the father wake up to what truly mattered. Her quiet sacrifices were no longer invisible. She was honored in their home, respected and cherished. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls with golden light, the boy walked farther than he ever had before. His crutches tapped slowly, his braces creaked softly, and his breath came hard, but he kept moving. His father walked alongside him, not holding him, not guiding him, but simply being there. When the boy finally reached the end of the hallway, he turned back with a wide smile. His father clapped softly, and the maid wiped her eyes, overcome with pride. That night, as they all sat together, the father spoke words that carried more weight than all the speeches he had ever given in his life. "From this day on, my greatest business is here," he said, pointing to his heart and then to his son. "My legacy is not in my companies. It is in you, in us, in what we build together." His voice trembled slightly, but it was strong enough to reach the boy's soul. The boy looked at him with eyes shining, and for the first time, he felt not just like a patient fighting to recover, but like the center of his father's world. He whispered back, "Then I'll make you proud, Dad." And the father, without hesitation, replied, "You already have." The mansion began to feel different in the days that followed. Laughter replaced silence. Hope replaced doubt. The father no longer rushed out in the mornings, leaving behind a house that felt like a museum. Instead, he spent his mornings walking with his son, cheering for every step. The staff, who had once moved quietly through their duties, now watched with smiles as their employer transformed into a man who valued hugs over handshakes, stories over statistics, moments over money. The boy's journey was far from finished. There were still days of pain, days when progress was slow, days when the braces dug into his skin and exhaustion weighed him down. But now those days no longer broke him. They became part of his fight, reminders that nothing worth achieving ever came easily. And with his father by his side, he had the strength to face them. The billionaire, too, faced his own challenges. The world outside still demanded his attention, still tried to pull him back into the endless race for more. But each time he felt the temptation to disappear into that old life, he remembered the sound of his son saying, "Look, Dad, I'm walking." That memory anchored him, reminded him that true legacy was not about how much he had, but about how much he gave. In time, the story of the boy's determination and the maid's devotion spread quietly among friends and family. Some admired the courage of the child, others the humility of the father, and many were moved by the maid's selflessness. But within the mansion, it was not about recognition. It was about a new way of living, a new definition of success. The father often sat at night in his study, no longer buried in financial reports, but reflecting on the journey they had all taken. He thought of the day he had come home early, unplanned, and had seen his son standing for the first time. That moment had changed everything. He realized that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive not in carefully scheduled plans but in unexpected moments, and he promised himself never to miss those moments again. The boy grew stronger. His steps became steadier. His arms carried less weight. His legs began to trust themselves again. Each milestone became a family celebration. Each achievement a reminder that miracles are often built one small step at a time. And through it all, the father's heart grew softer, fuller, and more alive. He no longer wanted his son to inherit only wealth. He wanted him to inherit values. He wanted him to know that courage was greater than fear, That love was stronger than distance, that presence was more valuable than any fortune. This became the new legacy he chose to build, a legacy of hope, resilience, and devotion. Years later, when people spoke of the billionaire, they no longer spoke only of his empire. They spoke of the man who came home early one day and discovered what truly mattered. They spoke of a father who learned from his son, a man who found his greatest fortune not in markets but in moments. The mansion, once cold and lifeless, became a place of stories, laughter, and warmth. And at the heart of it all was a boy who never gave up, a maid who never stopped believing, and a father who finally awakened to the truth that legacy is not about what you leave behind in banks but what you leave behind in hearts.